So, Gary, let's start by you telling us who exactly is, and I think our audience is familiar with, but give us a sense of how it is that Gary Cohn ended up in the White House.
Right. So Gary Cohn, director of National Economic Council, which in English means he's Donald Trump's top economic advisor, has an office in the White House, not far from the Oval Office. He was the president of Goldman Sachs. Really kind of an interesting story. Unlike many of the plutocrats who are running our country, was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Actually had a pretty rough childhood, was dyslexic long before folks knew how to deal with that, and was in 4 or 5 elementary schools, got in fights. Our president has boasted that he punched his second-grade teacher, music teacher, in the face. It turns out that he did not. Trump has confessed he hasn't done that, but Gary Cohn did. In 5th grade, he was frustrated with the teacher and punched him. So, his parents were told if he was a truck driver, they should be happy. Through true grit, becomes a aluminum siding salesperson, talks his way into a job on the commodities exchange, think trading places, think trading, coffee futures and that kind of stuff, and eventually gets a job doing the same at Goldman Sachs in the 1980s, a real plugger, real hard worker, real smart guy, real aggressive, the kind who would just run through walls to succeed. Ties himself to Lloyd Blankfein, who became the CEO of Goldman Sachs in mid-2000s, and named Cohn first as co-president. There was a fellow president, but Gary Cohn's a really good player, and within a couple of years, he had pushed that guy out and was the president of Goldman Sachs until being named Trump's chief economic advisor.
Now, I mean, just give us a sense. I mean, I am, and we will move forward in history to sort of understand why Gary Cohn stayed when there was pressure on him in particular because of what was going on in Charlottesville and the apparent, explicit endorsement of at least some of the Nazis who were marching.
And Gary Cohn is Jewish, so
yes,
he got extra pressure. He was singled out by outside organizations trying to pressure someone within the Trump administration to acknowledge the ugliness of
Yes,
Charlottesville.
Before we get there, though, let's go back. Why, when what is it about Gary Cohn that made him say yes to Donald Trump? Because that's not, it's not, you look at Donald Trump, the crew that he's assembled, there's not necessarily, it doesn't look like the A team. Let's put it that way. I mean, I think that's fair to say. To the extent that there are people of expertise, they tend to come from a military background, and there's some, they are at the very least have a pedigree that would make it hard for them to say no to a president. There were a lot of people who I think said no to Donald Trump. Was Gary Cohn going into this administration in some way to sort of save the country, or was it? What was his agenda, do you think?
Right. So Gary Cohn, a lifelong Democrat. You look at his political giving, and especially since 2010 and Dodd-Frank, the financial regulations that were put into place after the 2008 meltdown. He had given more, as did Goldman Sachs folks generally. They'd given more to Republicans than Democrats, but always a registered Democrat. Had nothing to do with Donald Trump prior to Trump winning the election. It's a great mystery, if you ask me, having spent a few months studying the man, writing about him. Ambition, some of it was that he was the number 2 at Goldman Sachs with a number 1 who wasn't going anywhere, so he was stuck. I mean, here's an opportunity. He had it's interesting. A few weeks after the election, Gary Cohn met for the first time Donald Trump, President-elect Trump at that time, and just was being called in to advise on economic policies, impresses Trump during that conversation. Trump's people reach out to Cohn, and to everyone's shock, including people inside Goldman Sachs, he said yes. The take on Gary Cohn, I would argue with it. We can argue with it. Is that he's the the moderate, the adult in the room that will prevent bad things from happening, just like the generals are supposedly going to stop bad things from happening on the international front. Here's someone who's well-respected, has relationships with the CEOs of every most of the Fortune 500 companies in our country, gave Trump an immediate legitimacy. I mean, just to kind of go in the Wayback Machine a year ago, people didn't know what to expect on Wall Street from Donald Trump. They were scared. And, here you name Gary Cohn and gives it legitimacy. To me, it was ambition, and also he had been pushing the Goldman Sachs agenda for years as the number two at Goldman Sachs. He was often the guy going to D.C., making the case to regulators and such, to legislators to change policy. Here he had a chance to really implement the Goldman Sachs agenda. Let's roll back financial regulation. Let's have a huge corporate tax cut. Let's privatize infrastructure. The Trump agenda and the Goldman agenda are now essentially one and the same.
That is, I'm not surprised, and I guess I'm not that shocked. But I guess when you put it, when you can sum it up in that sentence, that is stunning, based upon the conventional wisdom that we were told was Donald Trump's appeal. For those who did not accept that there was a massive racial component to this, the idea that Donald Trump's agenda would meld with Goldman Sachs. I guess, put another way, I don't think there would be that level of excitement amongst the red-hatted MAGA followers if he opened up with a promise. I promise you, we will make America Goldman Sachs again.
Well, I'll just remind people of the obvious, that when Donald Trump was running for president, first took on Ted Cruz, whose wife, Heidi, had worked for years at Goldman Sachs. And then, of course, Hillary Clinton, for her connections to Goldman Sachs, the paid speeches, the support from Goldman Sachs. So he actually candidate Trump made Goldman Sachs his stand-in for the kind of corporate interest, global interest, that's taking money from the hardworking people in the heartland and transferring to Wall Street. In fact, Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, in that final weekend commercial, great commercial actually from Trump, a couple minutes long, right before the election, Lloyd Blankfein was one of the images when he spoke about, I'm going to stand up to Wall Street, to the moneyed interest, those people who don't really do anything. They just move money around and get rich rather than investing in factories and creating jobs. And also he defiantly, deliberately, loudly campaigned against Goldman Sachs. And at one point when Scaramucci, in the 10 or 11 days that Anthony Scaramucci was part of the administration, Trump had 5 Goldman Sachsers in top positions, or 6 if you include Jay Clayton, head of the SEC, who was a lawyer for Goldman Sachs and whose wife, until his appointment, worked at Goldman Sachs.
All right. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the reasons why Gary Cohn stuck with Donald Trump through there, and then I want to pivot to what's happening in terms of Dodd-Frank being unraveled, and this tax deal. How much of this is the from the Goldman Sachs wish list, and to the extent that it might be a lot, what does that tell us about the fact that that Cohn was a Democrat before he joined this administration? We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.